Open borders, open markets, an interconnected world. But has the coronavirus and Great Lockdown made all that history?
Globalists, they're people that think we have to make the world wealthy at our expense. I don't even know where these people come from, but those days are over.
As the world economy slumps into recession, what sort of system will rise from the ashes of this crisis?
For years, there's been a growing backlash against globalisation. Now the virus has put the entire system at risk. Question is, for better or worse?
This shop is like a mini-universe, with dozens of different versions of our planet. A good place to pause for thought. What's happening to our world? Is the coronavirus killing globalization? Observers say we're facing three scenarios. First, the end of an era. In an interview, French President Emmanuel Macron said we have to think the unthinkable, and that globalization is reaching the end of its cycle. But is this a watershed moment? In this scenario, politicians and industrialists withdraw behind their borders. Companies localize supply chains, repatriate manufacturing, and stockpile supplies. Some leaders have been calling for nationalism for a while.
The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations.
Some say that's nonsense. They expect things to pick up where they left off. In this scenario, the world goes back to what it does best: turbo-capitalized, high-volume, high-speed trade. The intricate networks of supplies, goods, and profits have proven themselves for many. Travel and data transfers have never been so easy. Why change that?
Globalization is an external factor. It's not to blame for the virus. So it's hard to imagine everyone would go without the benefits of globalization due to something from beyond the system, to put pressure on finances, prices, and costs.
And so the wheel keeps turning. After all, how can you simply divorce the world from globalization?
People talk a lot about decoupling, or they talk about the end of globalization, and it's really a buzzword that has very little practical meaning. The internet, financial flows, the way supply chains are constructed, it's very difficult to think of a future where all of that is eliminated.
Difficult, yes, but impossible? Some analysts point to a potential reshaping of globalization, a new normal founded on morals and reason. The crisis could be the moment to push a green economy, a global Green Deal. We've seen how the climate can be protected, and the coronavirus has shaken us out of complacency towards nature as well.
In a moment where things are in flux, there's a lot of uncertainty, anything could happen. That window will close in the next 6 months to a year. And then we'll be just back to wherever we land after that period.
So does the world see the pandemic merely as a crisis that needs to be mastered, or as an opportunity? The mere fact the question is being posed shows how far the parameters of our world have shifted.
And for more, let's bring in Beata Jaworczyk. She's Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford and Chief Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It's good to have you with us. So what would you say, to what extent is the pandemic ringing in the end of the global economic system the way we know it?
The pandemic hit at the time when the global economic system has been under threat. The World Trade Organization has been weakened. The US-China trade war has not finished. The tensions between the US and China may reignite at any moment. So the biggest threat to globalization is not coming from the pandemic itself, but rather from the policy changes that may follow.
That, what you mentioned, exactly, the pandemic is actually enhancing protectionism that we've seen already before. However, does becoming less dependent on countries like China actually makes sense, business sense?
Well, the pandemic will change the way we think about global value chains. In the early days of the pandemic, the world suddenly became aware of how dependent we are on China in terms of parts and components, in terms of medical equipment, in terms of antibiotics or ingredients for medications. And I think the world will now want to move away from this concentration of suppliers towards more resilience.
So we're going more local, and of course that does not just apply for goods, because globalization is not just about moving goods, it's also about moving people and ideas. Do you think there'll still be room for that in a post-corona economy?
Well, I don't think we will necessarily go more local. I think when we think about global value chains, which have been optimized for cost and which work beautifully if all parts of the chain work like clockwork, we've seen that during pandemic, when various countries go in lockdowns at various points in time, the whole system breaks down. So the pendulum will switch from cost cutting to resilience. We'll move from just in time to just in case. And that means changing the geography of supply chains, building in redundancy, having more than one supplier.
Could it be that people could actually benefit from that? Because you say it worked wonderfully, but globalization was harshly criticized for leaving many, many people behind. So is now the perfect time to take a different attitude towards work and making a living?
Well, we all have been thrown into this giant experiment of remote work from one day to another. I mean, many people have been working remotely for part of the time, but there was a lot of hesitation. Bosses were concerned that workers would not work hard when at home, and workers were concerned that they would be passed for promotions if they don't see their boss on a daily basis. Now, many weeks into remote work, firms know whether this setup works for them or not. But once you cross this psychological threshold, this border into remote work, why constrain yourself with local workers? Why a firm in London or Berlin should rely on workers based in the UK or Germany? Why not hire somebody from Poland or Romania? So paradoxically, actually, this shift may not be good for local workers in advanced countries, but it may benefit countries with lower wages for skilled workers.
At the same time, of course, the pandemic has shown that an awful lot of jobs and business models are obsolete or are certainly at risk. Is now the time to discuss a basic income?
I think after the pandemic, we will certainly have a conversation about the social contract, what it is that we expect from the state. In many countries, the social contract has relied on people paying less in taxes and expecting little from the state. Now, I think people will want the state to insure the risk. People will want the state to provide more. So perhaps we will not go all the way to universal basic income, but certainly the social contract is bound to change towards more provision from the state and naturally higher taxes.
All right. Well, let's wait and see what the post-corona world has in store for us. Professor Beata Jaworczyk, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Monica.
Time for your questions now. Over to our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
Experts say if you eat meat from an animal carrying the virus, it's destroyed in the digestive tract. So how does it get into your respiratory system?
In previous epidemics with coronaviruses like SARS and MERS, transmission didn't occur through food. And to date, there have been no confirmed cases where somebody contracted COVID-19 through eating meat. So catching it that way looks unlikely, especially if the meat is cooked. The assumption, therefore, is that the first person or people who caught the virus didn't get it from eating an animal host, but by either being exposed via the air to the living, breathing animal as it shed virus, or through physical contact with a dead one. That's why there's been such a focus on the wet market in Wuhan associated with the start of this outbreak. live and dead animals from the wild were sold there. After jumping species to us, SARS-CoV-2 didn't need animal hosts to spread anymore. It started passing from human to human.
Does staying inside weaken your immune response because you aren't being exposed to as many microbes?
There's lots of evidence that spending too much time indoors isn't great for your immune system, not least because exposure to sunlight creates vitamin D, which is involved in immune response. And lockdowns can affect things like the amount of exercise you get or your sleeping patterns, which also play major roles in overall health. But is the immune system like a muscle that wastes away if it's not regularly challenged by pathogens? It's true that people like astronauts who are confined for long periods can have immune response problems, but don't forget that they're also exposed to things like high levels of radiation and weightlessness. And even in lockdown, our isolation isn't like it is for someone in space. After all, you still have to get out and go to the store every once in a while. So the general expert consensus seems to be that the effects of lower exposure to pathogens on your immune system should be pretty negligible, at least for a few months.
Is it true that those who've recovered from COVID-19 have major liver damage?
Health authorities report that some people hospitalized for COVID-19 do have increased levels of the liver enzymes linked to liver damage. Some estimates say almost half of all patients could have those elevated levels, but it still isn't clear whether the rise is caused directly by the virus invading the organ or whether it's a collateral effect, maybe caused by medications or possibly the patient's own immune response. So current research hasn't confirmed direct liver damage that's unmistakably attributable to SARS-CoV-2. And the kind of acute damage you're talking about certainly hasn't been reported in a widespread way among people who have recovered. But there are still many ongoing studies looking at how the virus affects the liver exactly and why.